Hey, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with a deck tech for the deck that I'll be running tonight in the Legacy Challenge. This is Green White Maverick. Last week we played Abzan Maverick, which of course splashes for cards like Plague Engineer, Abrupt Decay, and Thoughtseize. Green White is a little bit easier on the mana. We get to run double Forest, double Plains, 3 Savannah. I have seen some lists run a potential second Canopy over the third Savannah. But I do find that the second Canopy can come up a lot, especially against Delver, where every point of life counts. So I really like the third Savannah here. This is a metagame call just to allow me to play up my games without having to worry about getting wasted off a mana or not drawing into a mana when I need it. So some games you'll keep a hand with a Thoughtseize and Abrupt Decay with no actual black source, and it will come up where you just haven't drawn the source in time for those spells to actually matter. Maybe it's too late, or your opponent has stripped them from your hand. So I do like kind of going back to the basics here and playing with a pretty solid green-white strategy. Going through the mana base, pretty stock standard. You see a lot of green-white pilots running extra cards like maybe Maze of Ith, which I wouldn't count as a land because it doesn't have a mana, but cards like Maze of Ith, Dark Depths, Thespian Stage, Blast Zone can be a pretty nice one as well. Because you are just relying on your 2 mana, you do kind of have colorless as a third option, if you will. So you do get the possibility to run probably more utility lands in green-white than you do other varieties of Maverick. But I've gone with just making sure my foundation is correct, making sure that I am happy with the mana base that I have, because I think with Maverick you can really struggle if your mana base doesn't add up. So making sure that I'm hitting my Plains and Forest by turn 2 every time is pretty key. So I think that this is a pretty stock list to start out with in regards to the mana base, and probably one that I would recommend for any player wanting to play Green White Maverick. I guess the one utility here is probably the extra fetch. You can definitely get away with just the 6 fetches, and then I believe you have 7 fetchable sources as well as the Dryad Arbor, so it's always nice to have more fetchable sources than fetch lands, just in case you do draw into your Savannas and Plains and Forests early on, and then late game you actually don't have anything to fetch for. But the more fetches you have, the higher the chance of a Knight of the Reliquary being a 4/4 on as early as turn 2, the higher the chance you have access to Dryad Arbor in the mid to late game, and it's also just really nice again with Sylvan Library or something like that, being able to see a card on top that you want to pay for, but then shuffle the other one away. Obviously fetch lands do a lot of work there as well. To the mana dorks, we have 1 bird, 3 noble. I was going to play a 5th dork, but I think the 3-in-1 split is fine. My reasoning for birds is that it's just being a flyer is relevant, especially in a deck with Mother of Runes. It just does give us a way to kind of buy some time against decks like Delver and Dark Depths, which is really nice. In this deck with Stoneforge Mystic as well, it can attack, so the evasiveness of flying can be extra relevant, which is nice. And then there's small upsides against cards like Plague Engineer. If your opponent does name human, and they probably will against Maverick, as they know about things like Mother of Runes, Thalia, Thraben, and Noble Hierarch. Birds does kind of give you an out there as well, which is nice. And it's just nice to have a Green Sun's target that is a flyer, other than Scryb Ranger, which we'll get to in a second. But I think for now that the 4 mana docks are fine, and then we also have the Dryad Arbor as a way to accelerate on turn 1 with Green Sun Zenith, which is pretty fantastic. We then kind of have what I call the Death and Taxes portion of the deck, which is Mother of Runes for protection. I think the upsides of Mum right now against the downsides of cards like Plague Engineer are just too good not to play her. I think the format is incredibly fair right now. And against the unfair decks, it's really nice to have a curve of turn 1 Mother of Runes into turn 2 Gaddock Teeg or Collector Ouphe. There were a lot of times where I wasn't running Mum and just trying to either increase the power of my Green Suns package, add additional removal to the main deck, or even up the land count, where I had a Gaddock Teeg or a Collector Ouphe against the decks where they really mattered. A deck like Miracles, where Teeg turns off Terminus and Supreme Verdict. Collector Ouphe, some of the Storm variants can be really solid as well. But having it naked there was just a little bit too it definitely came up where having Mum or some sort of protection was very relevant, because my opponent was able to maybe Swords to Plowshares or bounce my Hate Bear at the end of their turn, untap, and then cast something that I definitely didn't want to get cast. So I really like Mum right now against really all variants. It also makes my control opponents really need to have that early removal, which is nice. For Thalia, just a great card in general. Great against combo, good against control, and pretty good against aggressive decks because of the first strike. I think she's very relevant right now against the decks where you really want her, so I didn't want to trim down to 3. I think that a stock 4 is fine. Not much more to say. It's also quite nice when sideboarding against it like Death and Taxes, where you obviously don't want your Thalias and your Gaddock Teeg. It makes it a lot easier to know how you're going to board for those decks. Mindcensor is an interesting one. Mindcensor is a card that has seen play in Maverick from time to time. I think it's pretty strong because it does make a lot of our poor to 50-50 matchups a lot better. Other Stoneblade decks, other Recruit of the Guard decks, against things like Elves for Natural Order and Green Sun Zenith decks. It's obviously quite good in the mirror. And in this deck is just another evasive creature that flies, that can also be equipped up with a Jide or a Sword of Fire and Ice, or in some cases a Batterskull. But I think Aven is good enough that what I always want to assess is the non-green card in this main deck better than a 5 of, thanks to Green Sun. So for every Aven Mindcensor that I'm adding into this list, I'm not adding, a Tireless Tracker, which isn't just 1 copy, it becomes 5 copies straight away because of Green Suns. But I think Aven is in that realm. It's a taxing effect, which is fantastic. It can really catch your opponent off guard, even with things like fetch lands. And yeah, I think having more flyers in the deck is really nice, because Green-White does have a little bit of a problem with cards like True Name Nemesis. So being able to fly over the top of them is pretty fantastic. 4 Swords, just really good removal. Would never change this. If anything, I would probably add maybe like a Path to the main deck, or some number of Skyclave Apparition if I really wanted more main deck removal. I did try to find some room for it. I looked at this list for like half an hour trying to like figure out where the Skyclaves could go on the main deck, and I think it was the Mindcensors that I kind of wanted to switch out, but I'm pretty happy with this, and I think it should be pretty strong. We then have the Stoneforge Mystic package, which is definitely not as stock as it used to be with Maverick. Stoneforge Mystic and its equipment are really nice, but I feel like in a lot of the matchups where it counts, you already have a pretty good matchup, but it does make sure that you are going to win those matches. So against decks like Death and Taxes, the Mirror, Stoneforge Mystic can definitely be a huge breaker in those sort of matchups. So I'm pretty happy to have 2, because we don't really have to rely on the equipment to make our threats. A deck like Death and Taxes, there are cards that your opponent doesn't have to really worry about, but once they're equipped, they become threats that your opponent has to worry about. So at least in this deck, where we have cards like the Reliquary, Questing Beast, they're already threats on their own. We don't really need the ability to equip them to kind of make your opponent focus on them to be removed. Batterskull is an interesting one. I was going to remove Batterskull because based on that thought process, you don't really need Batterskull in Maverick. Your threats are big enough. You don't need to have a turn 3 4/4 because your creatures are trying to disrupt in another location. But I just feel like if you're going to have a Stoneforge in the deck, a turn 3 Batterskull is just a good card still. It's not the greatest thing to be doing in Legacy, but against a deck like Blue-Red Delver, where they can go wide, especially when we don't have cards like Abrupt Decay or Plague Engineer to target things like Young Pyromancer, I do want a way to make sure that I'm not just going to die to a bunch of 1/1s. Same goes for Hogak. Hogak is a deck that can go wide and can be really good in that kind of strategy, because a lot of its smaller creatures, which we do have to care about at some stage once you get down to single-digit life totals, are very recursive. They come back from the graveyard like Bloodghast and Gravecrawler, and then they have some bigger threats that you might have to put 2 creatures in front of to stop, something like Vengevine. So Batterskull nice because it allows you to be aggressive and also defensive, thanks to Vigilance. So I think that Batterskull could be a cut, but I just think with Stoneforge and also Cradle, you do have some easy ways to get it out on the early turns. To the Green Suns package, Hex Drinker was an interesting one. Hex Drinker has been really solid as a 1 mana threat that I can find with Green Suns early on. And in some of the games where the board game stalls, it's been really nice to pump mana into and just win through a Hex Drinker, because once it gets to, even as a 4/4 and protection from instants, a lot of decks can't deal with it. You know, Petty Theft off a Brazen Burrower, Lightning Bolt, there's a lot of things that are turned off straight away once that protection starts. So my only piece of advice if you're playing Hex Drinker is be pretty patient with it. Don't pump mana into it in open mana if you don't have to. Maybe try to get a mum online first, or maybe get your opponent to tap out and then play it, because you'll be thoroughly rewarded for your patience if you do kind of do these steps to get your Hex Drinker in a position where you can tick it up without having to worry about a Lightning Bolt or a Fatal Push or a Swords to Plowshares. I did want to cut it because I feel like the Stoneforge Mystic turns a lot of my mana dorks into late game or mid game threats, which is nice. So maybe the need for Hex Drinker isn't there, but I just couldn't cut it. It wins a lot of games on its own. So I did want to keep it in for now. It's also a nice way to kind of get around True Name, and it just gives you a really nice clock from the early game. Skoos, fantastic. I think I and many more pilots should be playing 2 Skoos in their 75. I think Skoos is really good as just a threat, a piece of disruption. It's great against combo, it's great against control, it's great against fair games. It's probably one of the most underrated hate bears out there. When you think of a hate bear, you think of Thalia, Gaddock Teeg, you know, Ethersworn Canonist, but Scavenging Ooze is just so good at what it does. And the reason I wanted 2 was that against some of the Uro decks that are running around right now, I don't want to bring in Leyline against that deck because they don't use their graveyard as a resource in that way, but I do want extra graveyard hate post board, and I think a second Scavenging Ooze is a pretty good way for Maverick to deal with those decks, because it can be tutored with Green Suns, and no one expects the second Ooze. Once Ooze is off the table, most people forget about Ooze, but if the second one comes down, it can be really strong. Scryb Ranger, just one of those really tricky cards that some people don't know how to play around, and can get you some free wins. Things like blocking Delver is fantastic. It doesn't kill a flip Delver, but it does buy you some time. It allows you to get extra activations off Mother of Runes, your Noble Hierarchs and your Birds, your other Reliquaries, your Stoneforge Mystics if needed. It allows you to save your lands, like your Savannas, from Wasteland, which is nice if your opponent doesn't really know about it. And it also allows you to use your mana effectively if you don't draw a land for turn. You can tap a land like a Savannah for green and then untap it, return it, and then play it, and then get another mana out of it. You get it. Scryb Ranger is really nice. It does kill Phantasmal Image. Fun fact. Gaddock Teeg. Teeg is interesting. I think this deck right now has a pretty tough time against Bant Miracles, which is showing some promise in the format. And I wanted a way to really deal with Terminus Supreme Verdict Jace in game 1. So I would say this slot can be switched out with Collector Ouphe based on your local meta. But because I'm playing the Stoneforge Mystic package, and I do feel weak to some of those decks, I do want to play the Gaddock Teeg. Also pretty strong against decks like Ant and Tess, of course. Look out for things like Burning Wish into Grape Shot, so that's where Mum also comes in handy. But yeah, Teeg just really strong. Also, you can save it with Karakas, which is great. So maybe if you don't have a Mum around, but you do have a Karakas, you can still potentially save your Gaddock Teeg from being Swords to Plowshare or remove some other way. Pridemage is an interesting one because obviously Knight of Autumn got printed, which is here, and has a lot more text to it. So it's a lot more flexible. It can gain you life when you're behind. It can just become a big threat when you need it. But in a Stoneforge Mystic deck, I really like the Exalted of Pridemage. I also like that it is only 2 CMC, just lowering the curve slightly, but enough for me to actually be able to, have a way to deal with an artifact or enchantment on turn 2. I guess with the mana dork out, but I think that Pridemage, although it does sacrifice itself to deal with the potential threat, I think I did just want to have a way that I could, find a effect like this for 2 off Green Suns. But I still think Knight is worthy of a slot, so I did put it in the sideboard. I was thinking about Force of Vigor as a one-off, but again, as I said before, having it as a one-of compared to Knight of Autumn as a 5-of, thanks to Green Suns, it's really hard to it's really hard for me to actually I guess based off experience, think why Force would be better than Knight. And I think a lot of the time, being a creature deck, especially with, you know, equipment, I do just want another creature that can be turned into a bigger threat. So that's where, yeah, Knight got me in the sideboard, and that's why I kind of like Qasali Pridemage in the main deck. It just makes my creatures a lot bigger. It gives me more ways to actually get a bird attacking in the air with something like a Jide instead of a sword. I'm just a huge fan of Pridemage. It's also a card that I can use at instant speed, which is great. So for some reason, if my opponent maybe plays like a food chain and then starts going off, Knight of Autumn would have done nothing, unfortunately, being a sorcery speed spell. But Pridemage allows me to have some flexibility with when I actually want to pop it off, which is kind of nice. Ramunap Excavator. Ramunap in this build has actually taken the spot of the 4th Knight. And my reasoning for this is I think that a lot of the matchups where Knight is solid, we already have a pretty good matchup. So dropping the 1 Knight, in my eyes, isn't the biggest deal. Having 3 Knights or 4 Knights against the decks where it's really relevant is still going to be pretty close. But the flexibility of being able to add a second or an extra Green Suns target like Ramunap into the deck is really solid. And a lot of the times, once you've searched out a few Knights, you want to start using your graveyard to find your lands. So maybe you've used a Horizon Canopy or a Wasteland, and you want to use that straight away. So instead of, you know, finding a Knight with Green Suns, letting it untap, and then going and fetching what you want, you can just get a Ramunap and then get it straight from the bin, which is pretty nice. Ramunap and Dryad Arbor are also fantastic together to buy some time. I think that Ramunap's really nice, and I think that there is some comparison for the utility of it and how it does find your lands. There are some similarities between it and Knight, especially as the 4th Knight, because by then you're probably wanting to kind of do the same thing. So hopefully this is an okay experiment. Obviously Knight as a 4-of is something that Maverick has seen since its beginning, but I think right now, as good as Knight is, I don't mind just having the 3, because there's not too many matches that go the length of time where I need that 4th one, and I rather the flexibility of something like Ramunap. Questing Beast, what can I say? Just a really good way to pressure your opponent. It allows you to attack them and still deal with walkers in most instances. It doesn't care about things like Maze of Ith or Glacial Chasm. It doesn't care about True Name Nemesis, which is huge. Just overall, really, really like Questing Beast. This is where I put kind of like the consistency of the deck. So 4 Green Suns, 2 Library, just a really good card that I like. It allows me to hopefully get a draw engine going against decks that are a little bit slow, like some of the Miracles decks, or even something like Lands or Depths. Depths is especially relevant because if you're at 18 life or 8 life, it doesn't really matter. They're probably attacking with just a 20/20 to try to end the game. So if you can take advantage of Sylvan Library early on to try to find a way to win before they can get that happening, then you're in a really nice spot. 2 is just the number that I like because I get to see it more. But it's nice as well because if you have the first one out and come across the second one in your top 3, you most likely have a way to shuffle it away with Fetch Lands, Stoneforge Mystic, Green Suns, or Knight. And then the 3 Knights. Knight just really solid as well. A great turn 2 play, especially if you can get it out as a 4/4 against the Lightning Bolt decks, which is definitely something that comes up a lot if you fetch in your first few turns. But just generally an all-round great card. The sideboard. Okay. So this is my sideboard. Leyline of the Void has been exceptional for me. This is a deck that can cast it thanks to Birds of Paradise and Scryb Ranger, but I wouldn't say you can rely on that. Leyline is just a card that does exactly what I want for Graveyard Hate against the decks where you want this sort of Graveyard Hate. So against a deck like Hogak or Dredge or Reanimator, you really want to turn off their graveyard as a resource as early as turn 0. I do have an article in the Green Sun Zenith about the Graveyard Hate options in Maverick, if you want to check that out. Going over things like Nihil Spellbomb, Fairy Macabre, Surgical, Leyline, and just some of the reasons of why some are good in certain metas and why some aren't as great in certain metas. But Leyline just puts enough pressure on my opponent to find an answer for it in the matchups where it's really relevant, that when they usually do, I already have a board state of creatures that they then can't deal with. So if my opponent is trying to struggle to Careful Study or Faithless Looting into an Assassin's Trophy or some sort of removal spell for the Leyline, by then I probably have at least a Hate Bear down, or maybe something like a Knight, which is just going to take over the game if they can't find another removal spell for that creature. So Leyline really nice. Choke is just a fantastic card against the blue decks. Obviously more duels are being played right now because of Astrolabe out of the format. So I think Choke is a real way to pressure some of the decks like Bant Miracles, and even some of the Delver strategies based on the lands they play. I mean, Delver these days don't play a lot of non-island lands that they actually want to be using to cast spells. So Wasteland and Mountain out of Blue-Red Delver might see play, but a lot of the time, once you land a Choke, their lands are pretty much Lotus Petals, which is kind of nice. Do look out for things like Daze, because Daze does allow them to pull a tapped island from the battlefield and then replay it, but I think Choke is just in a really nice position right now, and this is a deck that can play it out pretty early on, which is nice. Knight of Autumn, just really good against a bunch of decks, a great Green Suns target, and I think because it is a Green Suns target, it is just, for me, I like it more than the one of Force of Vigor. If I did have 2 slots instead, and maybe, you know, didn't have the Ouphe or the Autumn in the sideboard and had the main deck, I might play Force of Vigor, because it can really get people. It's great against the Blood Moon strategies. It's great against Loman lands, where you can hit like Sylvan Library and Mox Diamond, or Exploration, and Valakut Exploration. But I think just being creatures, it really adds to the deck. Especially with a equipment package, I just want the Knight. Tireless Tracker is a card that I've been really fond of recently. Against a deck like Bant Miracles, I might drop something like another Reliquary, because they do play up to 6 or 7 basics. So Knight not as efficient at what it does against those decks. And Tracker just allows me to keep up with this card advantage. Just making sure that I can play it usually on turn 4, so I can play a land straight after. But if I am really needing to find maybe a Hate Bear, then I might play it into, you know, on turn 3 and then untap and try to get a land and a clue out of it. Ouphe, a really solid printing, probably one of the best printings last year for, actually Modern Horizons was a while ago. Definitely one of the most powerful recent green creature printings. There we go. Especially for Maverick. Being a Green Suns target means we can find it as early as turn 2 if you accelerate on turn 1. Great against Ant and Tess, great against Urza, great against other Stoneblade decks, where they might also rely on things like Aether Vial. Just a really solid card all around. Obviously, it can be killed by a lot of creature hate, so it's not as susceptible. It is a lot more susceptible to removal than something like Null Rod, but I think being a creature again with Green Suns, it just pairs really well. Skyclave Apparition. This is an interesting one. Skyclave, I think, hasn't had as much impact in Maverick than it has in decks like Death and Taxes, mainly because we don't have ways to utilize its power over and over again with flicker effects like Flicker Wisp. But I still think it's a really strong card that it's worth having in the 75. It's great removal for really anything from a Jason Mind Sculptor to an Aether Vial to a Jide to a Goblin Lackey or another creature, which is really solid. So Skyclave's in here as well. Canonist was a tough one. Deafening Silence is a card that I have a lot of respect for, especially in Maverick, because it is a turn 1 play that can really slow down a lot of decks you need time against to be able to play something like a Gaddock Teeg or Thalia against. So I did want to have some more flexibility in the sideboard. In the last challenge, we went down against Elves and Food Chain, which Ethersworn Canonist is pretty good against. So what I'm trying to say is that I guess for this deck list, I'm willing to put the flexibility of Canonist and its applicability in different matchups above having a 1 mana way to interact with my opponent on as early as turn 1, which is tough because, you know, if Ant or Tess do play something like Fatal Push instead of a Bounce Spell or Abrupt Decay, which hits both Ethersworn Canonist and Deafening Silence, then there is going to be positions where I go, I wish I had an enchantment there, because obviously it can't be Fatal Push. But I think Canonist is coming in against a few more decks, and also being able to be equipped and attack it allows me to not only apply disruption, but also pressure, which I think is probably the biggest advantage of Canonist, is that it also attacks, it applies pressure to your opponent. It doesn't just sit there and, you know, act as a speed bump until your opponent finds a removal spell. And then last but not least, Path to Exile. Path to Exile is just a really efficient removal spell. Against Rug Delver, most of the versions don't have a way to fetch up a basic, which is nice. Against a deck like Green-Black Depths or Lands, I am going to be winning through combat damage, so there are situations where I would much rather Path a 20/20 than give my opponent 20 life. Even if I'm giving them a land, it's sometimes a case of, is this creature doing more for my opponent than a mana would? And that question comes up a lot against elves. So am I going to Path its Heritage Druid and give them a land, or am I going to allow them to have it and then try to hit something else? So Path, a really nice one. Also just another nice 1 mana spell that can deal with cards like, it's the big whale, and I'm going to get it because I know it's here somewhere. Ethereal Forager, which I've been having a pretty tough experience with. That is the whale that's a 3/3 with Delve, and when you Delve it, any instants or sorceries that you delved away, you can put 1 into your hand every time it attacks, which is super strong. A little bit like a fixed Dreadhorde Arcanist, but something that doesn't die to Abrupt Decay, which I've definitely had multiple in hand against. So Path's just really nice because although sometimes you are giving away an early mana boost, against a deck like Death and Taxes, hitting a Mother of Runes, you are giving them that extra mana. Usually the upside is a lot more beneficial for you than the downside of giving them that extra mana source. That is Legacy Green-White Maverick. Obviously there's a few different builds you can take. If I was going to say there's some slots in this deck that can be seen as you know, things you can try out to remove, I would say it's probably these. I think Hexdrink has actually done enough for me to have it as a main deck staple for now, but I would say it's between the Stoneforge Mystic package, the Mother of Runes, and the Mindcensors. The Mum's probably on the maybe pile, and if you were going to cut these, I'd probably recommend some sort of Once Upon a Time package, and maybe running Skyclaves in the main deck. So maybe 2 Skyclaves, 3 Once Upon a Times, and then maybe even an extra Green Suns target. But there you go. I hope you enjoyed this. My name is Dukes on Twitch. I'm streaming tonight. I believe it's going to be live in about 5, 12, 7... about 7 hours. So 1 a.m. local is Legacy Challenge for me, which is tough. But you can find me on Twitch. I stream at twitch.tv/DukesOnTwitch, usually twice a week. Thursday nights at Australian Eastern Standard Time of 7:30 p.m. and Sunday mornings at 10:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. I do also have YouTube exclusive content, so if you are subbed here, you will get those notifications for when I upload those, usually weekly. But until then, let's hope that goes well. This should be pretty fun, and hopefully I'll see you in chat. But if not, take care, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.